My name is Kate Mower. I'm from the University of California, Riverside, and my paper is Indisputably Greek, Ethnonationalist Confrontations and Imperial Fabrications in the 19th Century Black Sea World. In Edward Whitmore's 1978 novel, Jerusalem Poker, three men sit at a table playing poker in the back of an antiquities shop in Jerusalem in the 1920s. Whitmore wrote that, quote, Greece has always been more of an idea than a place. When the modern nation was founded in the last century, Alexandria and Constantinople were the great Greek cities in the world, and Athens was a lonely plain where a few shepherds grazed their flocks at the foot of the Acropolis. But no matter, an idea doesn't die, end quote. This one quote encapsulates the whole of this paper. Constantinople was the great Greek city of the world, while Athens was just a blip on the radar. This paper explores the political moves in the 19th century to recenter the Greek homeland away from Constantinople in the Black Sea and towards Athens, and it explores the historical ramifications of that move. In May 2009, a letter was written and sent to then-President Barack Obama, which sparks questions about Greek and Balkan nationalism. It begins, quote, Dear President Obama, we, the undersigned scholars of Greco-Roman antiquity, respectfully request that you intervene to clean up some of the historical debris left in Southeast Europe by the previous U.S. administration. On November 4, 2004, 2 days after the re-election of President George W. Bush, his administration unilaterally recognized the Republic of Macedonia. This action not only abrogated geographic and historical fact, but it has also unleashed a dangerous epidemic of historical revisionism, of which the most obvious symptom is the misappropriation by the government of the most famous of Macedonians, Alexander the Great. We believe that this silliness has gone too far and that the USA has no business in supporting the subversion of history. Macedonia and Macedonian Greeks have been located for at least 2,500 years just where the modern Greek province of Macedonia is. Exactly the same relationship is true for Attica and the Athenian Greeks, Argos and the Argive Greeks, Corinth and the Corinthian Greeks, etc. We do not understand how the modern inhabitants of ancient Paeonia, who speak Slavic, a language introduced into the Balkans about a millennium after the death of Alexander, can claim him as their national hero. Alexander the Great was thoroughly and indisputably Greek, end quote. In a published classical journal review of the letter, Andreas Willi writes, quote, Some readers may be amused, as I was myself, when they first read what looks like a somewhat naive undergraduate essay, but the amusement disappears when one realizes that the letter has been signed by countless leading scholars, many of whom teach classics or ancient history at renowned institutions such as Harvard, Princeton, Berkeley, Cambridge, or Oxford, to name but a few, end quote. The letter had lasting and damaging effects in the field of ancient Macedonian studies. Classical scholars across the globe have ridiculed Balkan archaeology, the field of Thraciology in Bulgaria, and Dacian history in Romania as, quote, backward and antiquated for its nationalist foundations, while simultaneously supporting and upholding nationalist political boundaries based on ancient Greek ethnic boundaries. I argue that in the early 19th century, Greek nationalists and European imperialists worked to create a meaning of Greekness that centered on the boundaries of the Greek nation as it is today, and that the 2009 letter is a reflection of this imperial and nationalist process. British, American, and French scholarship have reflected on the Greek nationalist movement and Greek War of Independence as a standard for civic nationalism, rather than seeing it as a problematic ethno-nationalist movement promoted by imperialist powers. Catherine Kumarianu wrote that, quote, it should also be remembered that in the last decade of the 18th century, the French Revolution not only acted as an inspiration to the peoples of Europe, and in particular to the subject peoples, but it also provided the political and ideological content for movements which, until then, had been unable to express in concrete terms even their immediate aims or to organize their activities coherently. For the Greeks, the presence of the French Republican forces in the Ionian Islands in the years 1797 to 1798, quite apart from the moral force it exercised, constituted a very real stimulus to concrete political activity aimed at national liberation, end quote. The idea that the French occupation of parts of what is today Greece led to a desire by Greek peoples to have their own French Revolution is a stretch, but one that many Western scholars promulgate. It's a lingering French and British imperialist perspective in the scholarship. More specifically, this quote misrepresents what took place on the Ionian Islands. One of the leading figureheads of the Greek War of Independence, Count Ioannis Kapodistrias, was one of these Ionian intellectuals who had seen French colonization of his home, the Ionian island of Corfu. He writes in his journal about the Greek bravery to fight off the French. He also writes of the Greeks who desired and received aid from the Russian and Ottoman empires against the French. According to Kapodistrias' account, the Greeks, contrary to Western scholarship, developed a new republic separate from the French, but also worked to pay tribute to the Ottoman Porte. The treaty between the Ionians and the Ottomans was that the Ionians would be able to govern themselves under the direction of the Ionian state, pay tax to the Porte, and to be exempted from the presence of Muslims, both military and civilian. The Ottoman Ali Pasha, however, invaded the Ionian coast and islands with terror and broke these treaties. Because of this, the Ionian government approached the Russian Empire for aid against Ali Pasha. Kapodistrias, during this period after 1800, began his public career as a commissioner of the government for the islands, then a minister, and worked his way up to Secretary of State of Foreign Affairs. In 1807, unbeknownst to the Ionians, Ionian was ceded without its knowledge to Napoleon Bonaparte. Soon, Russian troops in Ionia were replaced with French troops. Kapodistrias joined the Ionian militia and wrote that, quote, "My relations with the Greeks of Epirus, of the Peloponnese, and of the archipelago therefore date from the time when, in serving my country, I also served Russia, with the great object of preserving Greece from the seductions of the French government," end quote. Here we hear something very interesting. The pushing back against Napoleon sparked a concept of Greek unity which did not exist before. A unity built against the French and with the support of Russia. After the Russians supported the Ionians against the French, Kapodistrias left to become a minister for Tsar Alexander I of Russia, and the British then replaced the Russians on the Ionian coast and islands. The British imposed an equally oppressive regime to that of the French. Like the French, the Greeks in Ionia felt oppressed by the British. He said his family and friends of Corfu were, quote, uprooted by the bad faith and false calculations of British agents, obliged to deliver their old homes to Ali Pasha for a modest sum of money, and carrying away with them only the exhumed bones of their fathers, end quote. The British had additional Philhellenic interests in the Ionian coast and islands and Greece more broadly. During the period of British occupation, British 19th century Romantic poet Percy Shelley famously wrote, quote, "We're all Greeks." The British occupier of the Ionian coast and islands, Sir Richard Church, is said by British historian William St. Clair to be, quote, "be more Greek than the Greeks," end quote. In London, Church briefed the European Congress of 1814 about the Ionian Islands. St. Clair says that Church's interventions, quote, "no doubt played a part in the decision when peace finally came in 1815 to retain the islands under British protection," end quote. As we examine the historical milieu in which the Greek War of Independence developed and took place, it becomes clear that the ideas and even scholarship about Greek nationalism have conveniently set aside the reality of imperial feuds over the whole of Southeast Europe. The British Empire sought to intervene in Greek affairs based on secular devotion to ancient Athens. The Greek War of Independence, while it has these initial imperial disputes in what we now call Greece, started on the Black Sea. On the northern coast of the Black Sea lies an internationally important port city, Odessa. Over the past 3 centuries, like those port cities to its east on the Crimean Peninsula, Odessa has played a role in many major international political and military confrontations. In the 18th century, Catherine the Great named the city Odessa. Catherine's Russian Odessa, however, was part of her Greek project, where she set out to reclaim all ancient Greek port cities on the northern shores of the Black Sea for Greek, or more broadly, Eastern Orthodox peoples. Catherine had taken up the idea of a Greek project from Peter I as he set his sights to conquer Constantinople. Peter referred to the city by its Greek colonial name, Byzantium. His efforts were to, quote, reestablish the Greek monarchy, end quote. In 1814, however, Odessa was the site of the first meeting of a secret society, or the Society of Friends, which was established, quote, by 3 impoverished Greek immigrants, end quote. Society member Nicholas Galatis had sent Count Capodistrias, who was by now the foreign minister of the Russian Empire, a letter from Odessa. Capodistrias gave the letter to Tsar Nicholas I, who read it with interest, and while Capodistrias wanted to dismiss Galatis and the society as a whole, Alexander told Capodistrias to meet with the young man. Capodistrias' autobiography gives the account, quote, Galatis then went to St. Petersburg and presented himself to me. He was in effect an emissary of a secret society exclusively composed of Greeks, which aimed to deliver their country from the Turkish yoke by means of a general insurrection. He came to propose to me that I should be the leader of this society and accordingly to direct its operations. Capodistrias did not support the society or Galatis. As a professional diplomat, he wanted to maintain good ties between the Ottomans and Russians, knowing that the British might pounce on any behavior that showed the Greeks were not aligned with the Ottomans and that the Russians were helping the Greeks. Here it's important to note who the Greeks were. Greeks were spread across the Ottoman and Russian empires. As Orthodox peoples, the Russians and the Greeks had a brotherly type affiliation. These Greeks were called the Pontic Greeks, and they affiliated with both the Russian and Turkish empires. The efforts by the Greek Phanariot princes in the Danubian principalities and the Society of Friends, however, did not desist. And by 1821, the Society of Friends had grown to include Greeks from a large number of diasporic communities across Europe and the Black Sea, attracting representatives from nearly every major social and regional group of the Greek world. However, the movement did not have an explicit concept of a Greek homeland. In 1821, David Brewer reports that there were 1,093 members of the Society of Friends. Quote, 3/4 of all the members were recruited abroad, over half of those in Russia and the neighboring principalities of Moldavia and Wallachia. End quote. These numbers complicate a notion of homogeneous Greek ethnicity and identity. A call for a Greek state, therefore, could not have a consensus nor been without deep contentions. In fact, the Russians and Greek idea of Greek homeland centered on Constantinople. George D. Frangos explains the deep class conflicts that prevented a cohesive Greek national consciousness, even at Odessa and among the Society of Friends. Frangos says that it, quote, would be a mistake to assume that this ethnic identity was felt by all Greeks or that it was synonymous with what is understood as modern national consciousness, end quote. Even in the midst of Greek revolution, Greek ethnicity did not play the large role that theory about national consciousness might suggest. Frangos insists that most Greeks lived in rural or primitive regions of the Ottoman Empire. Though their communities were organized along ethnic and religious lines, an individual's first allegiance was to his family. He referred to his village, or at most his region, as his patria or fatherland. While the Society of Friends brought together Greeks from across the Greek world, the majority were members of the educated and upper classes, primarily merchants. The Society of Friends were educated and well-read. They knew and read classical scholarship. They wanted a secular homeland centered on classical Athens, Thebes, and Sparta. The Society of Friends, as nationalists, had an idea of a homeland that matched that of the British and French Philhellenes. The Russian Philhellenes, along with the majority of Greeks, had an idea of Constantinople as the Greek homeland. The Romanian or Danubian principalities had operated semi-autonomously for centuries. They were caught between the Ottoman Empire and the Russian Empire, being led by the Ottoman Greek families, the Phanariots. By 1807, the Phanariots had lost power of the principalities, but the Phanariot prince Alexandru Ypsilanti was a member of the Society of Friends and eventually became the head of the society. Ypsilanti approached Capodistrias about the Society of Friends again. And again, Capodistrias offered his hesitations. Instead of minding those hesitations, however, Ypsilanti crossed the river Plouthe and entered into the Romanian city Iași. The Greek Revolution began with the invasion of Ypsilanti into Moldavia on March 6, 1821. At that point, two crucial things took place, one of which is important to the rhetoric of Greek nationalism, the other, the imperial response. From Yash, Ypsilanti gives his first rhetorical speech to his militia. Keeping in mind that his militia was made of Greeks from across the Balkans, but particularly the Danubian principalities and Russia, Ypsilanti had titled his militia the Sacred Band. The name was calculated and deliberate. The Sacred Band had been a famous military force in the classical period of ancient Greece from Thebes. In ancient literature, the military force continually beat back the Spartan forces. Ypsilanti called on a collective ancient Greek past with imagery of Epaminondas, Themistocles, and compared the Greek struggle with the Ottomans to the Spartan struggle with the Persians by using rhetoric of Leonidas and his 300. He linked Greekness to the ancient lands of Sparta, Thebes, Athens, and Corinth. If we remember from the beginning, so did those in the 2009 letter. His rhetoric highlighted a new type of nationalism, ethnonationalism. Ethnonationalism linked Greek land and territory with an ancient past rather than a religious past. This had devastating consequences over the next century. Pontic Greeks who'd lived on the Black Sea coast throughout the entirety of the Byzantine Empire, communities with roots as far back as 700 BCE, would be forced to migrate or be executed within a century of this designation of the homeland of the Greeks. This is during the Pontic Greek genocide. Ypsilanti and Capodistrias together became the faces of the Greek Revolution and the Greek state it created. Both held positions in the new Greek state. Imperial domination in the early 19th century Greece, as examined through the life and efforts of Capodistrias and the machinations of Ypsilanti, demonstrates how shifts in national consciousness around the ideas of ethnicity and nationalism moved more specifically to land, territory, and ancient heritage. The result of imperialists and Greeks making claims for ancient heritage and ancient lands led to similar nationalist movements in Southeast Europe. Croatia and Serbia had an Illyrian movement where Serbs and Croats made claims to ancient Illyrian heritage and looked to find boundaries of Illyrian territory for their nation state starting in 1835. The Bulgarians built an entire field of Thraicology based on their belief that they had ancient heritage linked to ancient Thrace. Bulgarians made claims to contemporary Macedonian territory based on ancient Thracian territory. Romania had two contending ancient pasts, Dacian and Roman. In 1848, a Romanian from Brașov wrote a poem that today is the national anthem of Romania. In it, it says, quote, "In these veins, Roman blood still flows," end quote. So it's no wonder that Macedonians from a small landlocked state claim ancient Macedonian territory and heritage. None of these claims are any more or any less legitimate than the Greek claims. None of them are any less fabricated than the Greek claims. Thank you.